I would like to welcome you all once again to this class in which we are going through the Turath, the works and the legacy of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyyah rahimahullahu ta'ala. And so the last thing we mentioned last week was the book that we will be starting with, and that is Al-Wabil Al-Sayyib wa Rafi' al-Kalim al-Tayyib. And I mentioned last week that there are translations that are available for this book. One is a translation that I have here called the Invocation of God. So Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala, he starts in the name of Allah. He says Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So Ibn Qayyim here, he starts off by mentioning that the servant lives in this world between three different states. The first is blessings, good times, prosperous times, where your life is going smoothly, everything is okay in your life, right? This is the ni'mah of Allah. These are blessings of Allah. What should you do with that? You should be grateful to Allah for that. The second state is adversity, tough times, calamities that afflict you. In such times, what should you do? You should be patient. You should persevere patiently. And thirdly, times in which we fall into sin. And so when we fall into sin, what should we do? We should seek forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so Ibn Qayyim, he mentions a beautiful point here. He says, with complete devotion, with complete ubudiyya comes complete kifaya. He says, al-kifaya at-tamma ma'al ubudiyya at-tamma. That with complete ubudiyya comes complete sufficiency of Allah. Because Allah says here, is Allah not sufficient for His servant? The true servant of Allah, who is always a servant of Allah in all states, in all conditions. He is the one who Allah will be there for him. Allah is sufficient for him. This person doesn't need anyone else besides Allah. And so with complete ubudiyya comes complete sufficiency. And then he says, and with less comes less. With less ubudiyya comes less sufficiency of Allah. By al-ghafla, by heedlessness, and by ash-shahwa, by lustful desires, and by al-ghadab, anger, the servants are tried and tested. These are three things that we are tested by in this dunya. And so Ibn Qayyim, he goes on to say, it is by these same three doors that Iblis, that shaitan comes to us. Try as much as you like to protect yourself, but you are bound to be heedless, and you are bound to follow your desires, and you are bound to become angry. So shaitan comes to us through these three doors. The door of ghafla, when we become heedless of Allah, and the door of ash-shahwa, of lustful desires, and the door of al-ghadab, of anger. So all of these things, Allah opens up the door for us after we commit a sin. This is only for those servants of Allah who Allah wants good for. And so if you find yourself falling into sin, and you find yourself turning back to Allah, repenting to Him, being regretful, having that remorse, having that feeling of humility before Allah, breaking down before Allah, and then doing good deeds, all of this is a sign that Allah wants good for you. As Ibn Qayyim mentions, he says, if the servant does all of that, and he keeps on doing this, his enemy, Iblis, will say, I wish I had left him and didn't make him to fall into what I made him to fall into. I wish I had left him without causing him to fall. So the main focus here, as you can see in all of these examples, is not just committing the sin, but what we do after that, turning back to Allah. That inaba, that turning back to Allah, going back to Allah, that itself is a huge act of ibadah. And Ibn Qayyim talks about this throughout his works. The concept of inaba, turning back to Allah. How are you going to turn back to Allah if there was never a time in which you became heedless of Allah? It only makes sense that you turn back to Allah, you go back to Allah after a period of heedlessness and being distant from Allah. If we were always attached to Allah, then we would be like the angels. If we were always devoted to Allah, that kind of ubudiyah.